so great, I'm going to have a big house and a cool boat and be blessed all the days of my life if I become Christian. No, Jesus said, in this world, if you're a human, you are going to experience the reality of human brokenness, difficulty, and weakness. But then he goes on and says, but, and that's so cool. Whenever God says but, it's like, okay, he's going to interrupt what we thought was the dead end with something that looks different. And he says, but take heart. So even though your human experience is difficult, you might be in a season right now where it feels like you're hitting a dead end. You've experienced so much devastation through the pandemic. You're like, God, where were you in all this? And he's saying, my child, I don't deliver you from, but because I'm resurrected, I will deliver you through. And so he says here, in this godless world, you'll continue to experience difficulties, but take heart, I have conquered the world. See, what he's saying is take heart in the difficulties you can't escape, because I've conquered death and will therefore deliver you through them. Just as Jesus had to endure the crucifixion to experience the salvation of resurrection, so too is that our invitation. So too is that our invitation to walk with him. See, God is not dead just because you can't escape your difficulties. He's alive and delivering you through them. This truth is communicated in the documented pages of history from the Old Testament book of Psalm 23, verse 4. We so often use this psalm to describe the end of a person's life, when in fact this psalm describes the general seasons of the human experience from beginning to end. And in one portion, we get to the human experience of facing death, where the psalmist writes, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Even though I have to endure human death, I won't be afraid of evil, because you are resurrected, alive and leading me to the doorway of deliverance. The problem is that when we face the valley of the shadow of death, the enemy wants us to believe death is a dead end so that we lose sight of the door. It's interesting how Jesus describes himself in the New Testament book of John chapter 10 verse 9, and he says, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. As we walk through the valley of the shadow of death in our human experience, the enemy wants us to fall into the false belief that death is a dead end so that we lose sight of the door of salvation. Just as on the Friday of Jesus' crucifixion, when he breathed his last breath and darkness fell, his followers scattered and hope was lost. So too, the enemy wants us to lose sight of the start of heaven's count of 3 towards Sunday's salvation. And he does this by casting shadows. The valley of the shadow of death. I'll never make it. That's seriously scary. How am I going to escape that? There's no chance for me. How am I going to deal with it? He tries to convince us that death is a dead end by casting shadows in the valley of our weakest encounters. The Old Testament book of Isaiah, speaking of God's people, writes these words in Isaiah 54 verse 17, that no weapon that is formed against you shall prosper. It doesn't say the weapon won't be formed, that the shadow will not be cast. It says that it won't prosper. It won't have destructive power. On the night of the 5th to the 6th of June, 1945, as part of Operation Titanic, the Royal Air Force dropped dummy parachutists filled with straw to simulate airborne invasion, and draw German forces away from the Normandy beach landings in France. The Allied deception strategy for D-Day was one of the most successful ever conceived. The Royal Air Force formed false dummy parachutists to deceive the Germans into thinking they were going to die. What formations has the enemy placed before you personally? What shadows has he cast in your personal life now that are trying to convince you that wherever you find yourself is going to be leading to a dead end? Is it your depression? Is it your anxiety? Is it your sense of self-worth? Is it the voices of what your father said to you, undermining you from a young age, that still seem to speak? Is it the hurt that's caused you to harden your heart? Is it the fact that so many times in the past you've made decisions which have left you feeling like a fool? Is it that when you gave vulnerability to others, they walked all over you? What formations has the enemy placed before you personally? You see, in the dark places of our lives, the enemy forms weapons against us by casting shadows that instill fear in an attempt to convince us that the valleys and even death itself are a dead end instead of a doorway. The doorway of salvation through the resurrected Jesus, even in the presence of death. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. It is death indeed that is before us in the valley. But it is only the shadow. It's only the shadow of death. There is no substantial evil in it. The shadow of a serpent will not sting, nor the shadow of a sword kill. The weapon may be forged, but by the resurrected power of Jesus, it will not prosper. Jesus' resurrection means that the valley of the shadow of our death, our moments of struggle in the seasons of darkness, don't necessarily call for dead ends, but become doorways to deliverance. And that means that when I face Friday's affliction, I count to 3 because I'm no longer dead, devil, I'm delivered. And so the New Testament book of Hebrews chapter 2:14 describes this when it says, since the children are made of flesh and blood, you and I, it's logical that the Savior took on flesh and blood in order to rescue them by his death. By embracing death, the death he endured, taking it into himself, he destroyed the devil's hold on death and freed all who cower through life, scared to death of death. Whenever you're feeling defeated, when you're in the valley of the shadow of death, fear not. Pause and count to 3. Because even in the afflictions of your Friday, Sunday's coming. And I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God.
A slave